Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material. So I want you to imagine a text that admits right up front that humans are biologically predisposed to, mischief and bloodshed.
Right.
But then it turns right around and argues that this flawed, violent, messy species is actually superior to flawless, perfectly obedient angels.
Which is, that's a wild pivot.
It is. It's a completely jarring premise. And that is exactly what we are looking at today as we dive into a really profound collection of ancient wisdom. So for this deep dive, we are focusing on chapters 2, 3, and 4 of the Qur'an.
Right, which are known historically as the cow, the family of Amran, and the women.
Yeah. And if you are someone, tuning in who's trying to extract practical life application from foundational texts, regardless of your personal theology, you're in the exact right place.
Absolutely. Because it's a premise that, it immediately forces you to drop your modern assumptions about how religious texts operate. Like these specific chapters represent a massive pivot in human history.
Yeah, they really do.
We're analyzing a moment where a community transitioned from this abstract, purely spiritual survival mode into the literal, incredibly complex building blocks of new society, economy, and legal framework.
Right. But before we get into that whole societal architecture, I actually want to address the friction I felt on, page 1.
The opening lines.
Yeah, exactly. So chapter 2 opens by stating that this text is a guide for those who believe in the unseen.
Right. The unseen.
And I gotta be honest, my modern, hyper-rational brain just immediately hit the brakes. Because the unseen sounds like an outright demand for blind faith, like ghosts, mysticism, or just checking your logic at the door.
Yeah, it sounds like magic.
Right. So how are we supposed to reconcile that with a deep dive that's meant for a modern listener who really values evidence?
Well, that reaction is entirely expected. But the commentary we're using today fundamentally reframes that whole assumption. The Arabic term there is al-ghaib, which means the unseen.
Okay.
And rather than asking you to abandon your intellect, the source notes argue that accepting the unseen is actually the foundational epistemology of all human progress, especially science.
Wait, science? How so?
Yeah, because the text points out that every single rigorous scientific discipline is based on fundamental principles where the ultimate truth is witnessed only in its resulting effects, not in immediate tangible visibility.
Okay, right. So we're basically talking about the theoretical physics of morality here.
That's a great way to put it.
Like if I think about gravity, or even something like magnetic field, I can't, hold a piece of gravity in a jar and show it to you.
Or you can't put it under a microscope.
Exactly. I can't look at it.
Yeah.
But I base my entire physical reality on its undeniable, measurable effects.
Yep.
Or to bring it into everyday life, I was thinking about compound interest.
Oh, that's a really good analogy.
Right. You cannot perceive compound interest acting in real time on a random Tuesday morning.
Yeah.
It's totally invisible, yet you structure your entire financial future around the belief in its eventual outcome.
Exactly. And the text is demanding that exact level of sophisticated long-term reasoning be applied to human behavior and universal justice.
So it's not blind faith.
No, not at all. Believing in al-ghaib is an invitation to acknowledge that the most powerful forces shaping our lives, consequence, moral order, human potential, they are realities whose ultimate truths are witnessed over time.
Over time, right.
If you demand immediate visual proof of everything before you take a step, you essentially freeze yourself in a state of intellectual paralysis.
Wow, yeah. Which actually leads us perfectly to the story of Adam in chapter 2, around verse 30.
Yeah.
Because this allegorical narrative completely blew up my understanding of how ancient texts view humanity.
It's a fascinating passage.
It really is. The text describes God announcing to the angels the intention to place a Khalifa on earth.
And Khalifa is the operational word there. It translates to a successor, a ruler, or an entity granted dominion and moral agency.
Moral agency.
Right. It's a delegation of profound responsibility.
And the angels put up a very logical objection, which I kind of love. The source material shows them essentially submitting a risk assessment report.
Yeah, they're like the divine HR department.
Exactly. They say, why would you put a being on earth who is going to make mischief and shed blood while we just celebrate your praise and purity all day?
Right.
They look at the human prototype, they look at our capacity for violence, and they basically say the risk profile here is disastrous.
And what's remarkable is that the divine response does not contradict their assessment.
It doesn't.
There is no naive assertion that humans will be perfectly peaceful.
Mm-hmm.
The text readily admits the human propensity for corruption.
Right, it doesn't sugarcoat it.
Not at all. But instead of arguing about our morality, God's response is to teach Adam the names of all things.
The names of all things.
Yeah, and the commentary is very specific here. It says, this means granting humanity the knowledge of the attributes, descriptions, and characteristics of the physical and conceptual world.
Naming things. I mean, this is categorization. This is the root of speech, of the scientific method of philosophy.
It is the unique evolutionary advantage of the human intellect. So after teaching Adam these names, God challenges the angels to name the things.
And they can't.
Right. The angels admit their limitation. They say, we have no knowledge except what you have taught us. Their existence is static. They are purely good, yes, but they do not have the capacity for independent discovery or growth.
That is a massive theological pivot. I mean, most traditions prioritize pure obedience above all else.
They do.
So to say that human intellect, which inherently comes with the risk of rebellion and bloodshed, is ranked above flawless angelic obedience, that feels almost dangerous. Does the text really justify taking that risk?
It does, by commanding the angels to bow to Adam. They're literally commanded to submit to human potential.
The implication is staggering. The capacity to learn, to analyze, and to exercise agency in a complex world is a higher form of existence than static, untested purity. The text is validating the messy, flawed, highly capable reality of being human.
I love that. And if the core defining trait of our agency is the ability to name and categorize, that feels like something we can use right now. Let's pull a practical application out of this.
Let's do it.
We can call it the Khalifa practice. So when you are facing a crisis, say your career feels stuck or your personal life is just a mess, we often get paralyzed because we view the problem as a giant, dark, unseen cloud of anxiety.
Yeah, we default to emotional overwhelm rather than intellectual agency.
Right. So the practice is extreme clarity through naming. You sit down and do exactly what Adam did, break the chaos down and name its specific characteristic.
Be precise.
Exactly. What exactly is failing? Is it a cash flow problem? Is it a communication breakdown with a specific colleague? Are you lacking a specific skill?
Right. You name the beast. Yes. The moment you name a fear or a problem, it loses its mythical power and becomes a manageable data set. You apply intellect to emotion, acting as the agent of order in your own life.
And applying intellect to chaos was exactly the challenge the early Muslims faced as we move into the historical context of these chapters.
Which brings us to the transition from Mecca to Medina.
Yeah, this context is vital. You can't read these legal and social frameworks without knowing the crucible they were forged in.
Definitely not.
For the first 13 years in Mecca, this community was a persecuted, tortured minority. I mean, they were economically starved and assassinated. Then they migrate to Medina.
And the migration to Medina changes everything. They are no longer a marginalized philosophical study group. They have to form a functioning republic.
Right. Think of it like a rebel alliance that just successfully overthrew a tyrannical regime, or at least escaped to form their own territory.
In the movies, the story ends when the rebels win. But in reality, suddenly the romance of the rebellion is over. Now you have to figure out sanitation, taxation, agricultural treaties, a defense budget.
The boring stuff.
The boring, hard stuff. And you have to figure out how to deal with the people who just joined your movement because you're suddenly the ones in power.
And dealing with those opportunists becomes a central theme, particularly in the opening verses of chapter 2. The text introduces the concept of hypocrisy, or lip profession. People who claim to belong to the community but harbor a disease in their hearts.
Because in Mecca, there was no social advantage to being a Muslim.
None. Claiming the faith could get you killed.
Right, but in Medina, political power was shifting. Suddenly, it made strategic sense for certain tribal leaders to pretend to align with this new movement.
And the commentary dissects the psychological profile of these individuals with brutal precision. It uses two incredible parables. The first is the parable of the fire kindler.
Right, I remember this one.
The text describes a person who kindles a fire for warmth and light in the darkness. But once the fire illuminates his surroundings, the light is taken away, leaving him in utter darkness, unable to see.
I found the commentary's interpretation of that really striking, because on the surface, God taking away their light sounds almost punitive or arbitrary.
It does. But the source notes clarify that the taking away of the light is the natural psychological consequence of their own bad faith.
How so?
Well, the light represents the initial safety and illumination they found by joining the community. But because they were acting deceptively, seeking only material advantage and plotting mischief, they destroyed their own capacity to perceive the truth.
Oh, wow.
They chose the darkest of deception, so they are left in it. They essentially render themselves deaf, dumb, and blind to reality.
So they gaslight themselves into permanent blindness.
Exactly.
The second parable, the thunderstorm that dives even deeper into the anxiety of these fence-sitters.
Yeah, the text compares them to people caught in a torrential rainstorm, surrounded by utter darkness, thunderclaps, and lightning. In terror of death, they jam their fingers into their ears.
And then what happens?
When the lightning flashes, they walk a few steps in its light, but when it goes dark, they freeze.
That is a masterclass in describing cognitive dissonance.
It really is.
Because the storm represents the undeniable, difficult realities and hardships of building this new society. And instead of facing it, they literally plug their ears.
All right.
When things look good, when there's a victory or an economic boom, the lightning flash, they move forward with the community. We're with you. But the second there's a setback or the light fades, they stand still, paralyzing the community from within.
And the text diagnoses this as a self-inflicted sickness. They mistake their own cynicism for strategic brilliance.
That's the worst kind of arrogance.
It is. The most chilling detail in the text is when they were confronted about their subversive behavior and told not to make mischief. Their immediate response is, "We are only peacemakers."
I have worked with that exact person.
Haven't we all?
Seriously. The rallying cry of the toxic operator is always, "I'm just playing devil's advocate," or "I'm just trying to keep the peace," while actively pitting departments against each other.
Right.
They genuinely believe their double dealing is a high form of diplomacy. The text strips away that illusion, exposing it as a profound internal rot that threatens the survival of the group.
And internal rot was only half the problem. They were surrounded by external armies from Mecca that were actively marching on Medina to wipe them off the map.
Right. Which forces us to confront some of the most difficult, jarring passages in these texts. The rules of warfare.
Yes.
And I'm glad we are addressing this because as a modern reader, I usually hit a wall here.
It's very common.
When you read ancient texts discussing combat and warfare, it's incredibly difficult to extract enduring moral wisdom. It feels deeply disconnected from our modern sensibilities.
It does. And that reaction requires us to apply wisdom with deep discernment. We must distinguish the underlying ethical framework from the brutal historical necessity of 7th century survival.
Okay, so where does the source material start with that?
It brings us to chapter 2, verse 190, which lays down the foundational rule of engagement. It says, "Fight in the way of Allah against those who fight against you, but be not aggressive."
But be not aggressive. How exactly did that play out in a historical era where warfare was generally characterized by total, unconstrained slaughter?
That's the key question.
Right, because when I read ancient accounts, cities are razed, the earth is salted, everyone is taken captive. How do you limit warfare when your enemies aren't playing by any rules?
It was a revolutionary constraint. Prior to this, blood feuds lasted generations. But the text imposed rigid legal boundaries. It strictly forbade fighting during the 4 sacred months, unless the community was attacked first. It demanded the honoring of treaties. But the most profound shift is in the stated purpose of the fighting. The commentary explicitly notes that combat was ordained solely to stop persecution and establish religious freedom.
I struggle to associate religious freedom with 7th century warfare. That sounds like we're mapping a modern democratic ideal backward onto an ancient text.
It does sound modern, but the source explicitly grounds this in the Quranic text itself. The Muslims were commanded to fight to dismantle systems of oppression that were destroying houses of worship.
And not just their own.
Exactly. The commentary specifically lists those houses: cloisters, churches, synagogues, and mosques. The mandate was to protect all places where God was worshipped, regardless of the specific tradition, from totalitarian destruction.
That is a staggering detail. The instruction wasn't fight the pagans until they convert and agree with your theology.
No.
It was fight the oppressors who were stopping the Jewish, Christian, and Muslim populations from worshiping freely.
That is the exact mechanism. This is anchored by the famous verse from this section. There is no compulsion in religion.
There is no compulsion in religion.
Right. The surah was authorized strictly to protect the freedom of beliefs, not to enforce the belief itself.
So the modern translation here isn't a justification for violence. It's an exploration of the moral obligation to stand up against tyranny.
Exactly.
It's about protecting the vulnerable while maintaining strict ethical boundaries, even when you are under existential threat. You don't become the monster to fight the monster.
Which perfectly transitions us into how they handle their own internal vulnerabilities, specifically concerning social laws, women, and property, which dominate Chapter 4 and Nisa, or the women.
This is another area where modern readers recoil.
Yes.
You read ancient patriarchal frameworks and it feels incredibly jarring. How does a 21st century listener find enduring wisdom in 7th century social laws?
By analyzing the trajectory of the reform, Chapter 4 was revealed largely in the aftermath of the Battle of Uhud, which we'll discuss deeply in a moment. That battle was a devastating military defeat that left Medina with an unprecedented number of orphans and widows. They were on the brink of a total humanitarian and economic collapse.
To understand the impact of Chapter 4, we have to look at the economic reality of pre-Islamic Arabia. Women weren't just disenfranchised, they were literally considered capital.
Yes, chattel.
If a man died, his brother would inherit his tent, his camels, his debts, and his wives. A widow was an asset on a ledger, inherited against her will.
Against that brutal economic backdrop, Chapter 4 drops like an earthquake. It fundamentally disrupted the tribal economy by mandating that a dowry was a free gift that belonged entirely to the woman.
Not her father.
Right. It was no longer a bridal price paid to her father. It was her own independent capital.
And it outlawed the inheritance of women.
Completely. But it went further. It established legal inheritance rights for women. Suddenly, women were receiving a share of the estate.
The tribal elites must have been furious. Capital was leaving their exclusive control. This wasn't just a nice moral suggestion. It was an economic revolution.
It really was.
It was a massive wealth transfer from the patriarchal elite to the most vulnerable members of society.
The text also set up uncompromising rules for male guardians managing the property of orphans, warning them with severe consequences not to consume the orphans' wealth unfairly.
While our modern legal concepts of equality have obviously continued to evolve, the wisdom here is in the mechanism of societal restructuring. The text challenged the entrenched status quo of its time to elevate the marginalized.
Exactly.
The question it forces on a modern listener is, who are the vulnerable in our specific society today? And are we structuring our businesses, our laws, and our communities to protect them from exploitation, even when it costs the elite?
Speaking of wealth and exploitation, the text dives deep into the psychology of capital, drawing a sharp contrast between two distinct economic models, zakat and usury.
Let's define the mechanisms here. Zakat is usually translated as charity, but the text describes it as something more systemic.
The source text frames zakat as a mandatory tax for brotherhood. It literally translates to purification.
Purification, wow.
Yeah, it is the intentional, required giving of a portion of one's wealth to support the poorer members of society. It's an economy of circulation.
Right.
Usury, on the other hand, charging exorbitant interest on loans, is strictly condemned.
And the text critique of usury isn't just about bad math, it's about psychological rot. The commentary notes that usury breeds an inordinate love for wealth.
It does.
It's a system where capital exploits desperation to make more capital, whereas charity lifts the baseline of the entire community.
The text goes even deeper into the psychology of hoarding. There's a specific verse, chapter 2, verse 268, that provides a profound diagnosis of human anxiety.
That verse stopped me cold. It says, "The devil threatens you with poverty, and Allah promises you forgiveness from himself in abundance."
The devil threatens you with poverty.
That phrase perfectly encapsulates what modern behavioral economists call the scarcity mindset.
How does that manifest in a modern context?
Well, think about the root of our worst behaviors. Our hoarding, our cutthroat competitiveness, our anxiety, so much of it stems from a deep-seated, terrifying fear that there isn't enough to go around.
Right.
We hoard our money, we hoard our time, we hoard credit at work, all out of this whisper that we will run out. We are threatened by the illusion of poverty.
The ancient text is diagnosing this fear as an external manipulation, a lie meant to control you. The counterintuitive truth it presents is that giving intentionally spending out of what you have been given is the only way to break the psychological grip of scarcity.
Let's attach a practice to this right now. The scarcity reflection. You need to audit your life and ask a direct question. Where is the threat of poverty making me act out of fear?
It's a hard question to answer, honestly.
It is. Identify one specific area where you are hoarding. It might be financial, but it's often social. Are you hoarding praise, refusing to acknowledge a colleague's good work because you fear it diminishes yours?
Yeah.
Are you hoarding time, constantly telling your family you are too busy?
Once you identify the area, the practice is to engage in intentional, uncomfortable generosity.
Uncomfortable generosity, I like that.
If you're hoarding praise, go out of your way to publicly elevate a coworker. If you're hoarding time, volunteer an hour with zero expectation of return. You have to physically act out abundance to short-circuit the brain's scarcity loop.
You cure the fear of poverty not by hoarding more, but by giving away, because giving is the only empirical proof to your own brain that you actually have enough.
That concept of breaking negative psychological loops is also central to how the text deals with profound failure and resilience. We mentioned the Battle of Uhud earlier. We need to look at the post-mortem analysis of this battle in Chapter 3.
Let's set the stage because the psychology of this defeat is fascinating.
It really is.
The Muslims are defending Medina against a massive Meccan army. They take a strategic position near Mount Uhud. The Prophet positions 50 archers on a hill with a strict, explicit order.
He says, "Do not leave this spot under any circumstances, even if you see us winning, even if you see us dying."
It was the linchpin of their defensive strategy. And initially, the Muslims are successful. The Meccan army begins to retreat.
And this is where human nature overrides discipline.
Right. The archers on the hill see the enemy retreating. They see the spoils of war, the plunder being left behind on the battlefield. The scarcity mindset kicks in.
They think the battle is over and we are missing out on the wealth.
40 of the 50 archers abandon their posts to run down and grab the loot.
That single breach of discipline exposed their flank.
Yeah.
The Meccan cavalry, led by a brilliant tactician named Khalid bin Walid, immediately saw the opening, flanked the Muslim army, and launched a devastating counterattack.
It was absolute chaos. Many prominent Muslims were killed, and there was even a rumor that the Prophet himself had been killed. It was a moment of absolute despair and shattering grief.
The commentary on this in Chapter 3, verse 153, is arguably one of the most advanced pieces of psychological wisdom I've ever read.
Oh, totally.
It states that God gave them sorrow after sorrow, or grief upon grief, so that they would not grieve at what escaped them.
That phrasing is highly counterintuitive. You are given sorrow so that you won't grieve.
It sounds paradoxical until you view it through the lens of exposure therapy, or what Nassim Taleb calls anti-fragility.
Right. The text is analyzing their misplaced grief. Initially, the archers were grieving over lost worldly gains, the plunder they thought they were missing out on.
And the text says, essentially, you were subjected to compounding catastrophic failures, losing the battle, losing friends, facing total annihilation so that you would learn to stop crying over spilled milk.
Exactly. It's the ultimate crucible. Once you survive the absolute worst-case scenario, the trivial things that used to destroy your peace of mind just evaporate.
Yeah, they don't matter anymore.
The human spirit is tempered in the fire of compounded failure. If you lose your job, your car breaks down, and you suffer a health scare all in the same month. When you survive that, a rude comment from a stranger 6 months later just bounces off you.
The text is validating the brutal, painful mechanism of building resilience. It recalibrates your scale of what actually matters.
It forces the realization that discipline and ultimate purpose are infinitely more valuable than temporary material gain.
And this profound understanding of human nature, failure, and resilience is exactly why this text does not view itself in isolation.
That's a great point. There's a common misconception that religious texts always claim a monopoly on truth, insisting that everything that came before them was a complete lie, a sort of historical year zero.
But the Qur'an, particularly in these chapters, actively rejects that premise.
It does. It explicitly and repeatedly affirms previous revelations. It honors the Torah. It affirms the gospel. It names and honors previous prophets like Abraham, Moses, and Jesus.
It frames itself not as a negation of the past, but as a continuation and completion of a long, ongoing dialogue between the divine and humanity.
The source notes point to a highly specific textual continuity. They argue that this text fulfills a prophecy found in the Bible, in Deuteronomy 18:18.
Yes, the passage where God promises Moses to raise up a prophet from among their brethren who will speak the words commanded to him. The commentary argues extensively that this points historically and genealogically to the prophet Muhammad, coming from the lineage of Ishmael, the brethren of the Israelites, delivering a unifying message.
Whether a listener approaches that specific claim as a theological believer or strictly as an academic analyzing historical texts, the structural lesson is profound. Truth is cumulative.
The text insists on the unity of Allah, but it expands this beyond a narrow religious doctrine. It presents it as a universal principle reflected everywhere in existence.
The source material connects the monotheism of religion directly to the uniformity of nature.
How so?
Well, just as there is one underlying order to the physical universe, one set of physics governing the stars, the oceans, and biology, proving order over chaos, there is one underlying moral and spiritual truth that has been progressively revealed to humanity.
It's an incredibly expansive worldview. It's saying, look at the stars, look at the ecosystem, look at the history of previous nations. It is all pointing to the exact same singular reality.
And if we are living inside that singular, unified moral reality, the ultimate question is how we interact with the people around us who also exist in it.
Yeah, that's the day-to-day application.
Exactly. I want to bring up a tiny detail I found hidden in the footnotes of the source material for Chapter 3. It's a historical anecdote about a prominent early figure named Hassan, and it illustrates a practice we can call the forgiveness formula.
This story is meant to illustrate the Quranic verse describing the righteous as those who restrain their anger and pardon men. Hassan had a servant, and one day, this servant accidentally dropped a bowl of boiling hot broth on Hassan.
Boiling hot broth. In an era with rigid class structures and master-servant dynamics, the immediate culturally accepted reaction would be absolute rage, screaming, and severe physical retaliation.
This servant was terrified. Expecting the worst, he immediately quoted the verse to Hassan, "Those who restrain their anger."
Wow.
Hassan, fighting his very natural human biology and instinct for retaliation, replied, "I restrain my anger."
Just incredible.
The servant, pushing his luck, continued the verse. "And pardon men." Hassan said, "I pardon you." And then the servant finished the verse. "And Allah loves the doers of good."
And this is the moment that completely short-circuits normal human behavior. What did Hassan do?
Hassan replied, "I give you your liberty and 400 pieces of silver."
He didn't just suppress his anger. He didn't just offer a grudging, teeth-gritting pardon. He freed the man and gave him wealth.
It is a stunning example of disproportionate grace. And this is the practical tool for the listener.
Yeah.
We all face moments where we are wronged by someone's honest mistake. A colleague drops a ball on a major presentation, a spouse forgets something deeply important, someone cuts you off in traffic. The biological instinct is to punish, to yell, to assert dominance, and demand justice.
The practice here goes beyond suppression. Suppressing anger is only step one. The actual practice is to actively reward the negative situation with grace. Yes. Next time someone makes a painful, honest mistake that impacts you, find a way to actively bless them. Buy them a coffee. Overwhelm the negativity with an unexpected act of generosity.
It completely breaks the cycle of resentment, both in them and, more importantly, in your own mind. It takes the muddy waters of human conflict and injects pure, unified clarity into it.
And mastering those internal reactions is the ultimate goal. Which brings us to a final, compelling concept in Chapter 2 regarding fasting.
Yes, verses 183 to 185 outline the concept of fasting during the month of Ramadan. No food, no drink from dawn until sunset.
But when you look at the commentary, it becomes clear this isn't merely a dietary restriction or an exercise in forced empathy for the hungry. It is a profound psychological training camp.
The source material argues that fasting is the ultimate exercise in realizing the human potential we talked about at the very beginning, the Khalifa. If a human being can command their own biology, if you can look at food and water, the most basic, undeniable survival needs of your physical body, and voluntarily renounce them for a higher purpose, you prove to yourself that you are not a slave to your instincts.
And if you aren't a slave to your own biology, you become entirely impervious to external manipulation.
Exactly.
Think about it. The world tries to control you by threatening your comfort, your wealth, your status. But if you have trained yourself to master your deepest, most screaming physical cravings, what external threat could possibly control you?
None.
So here is the provocative thought to take with you today. If you can master your hunger, what else could you master that you currently think controls you? Your anxiety, your anger, your fear of scarcity.
The ancient wisdom says the control is already yours, you just have to practice it.
The discipline of the unseen gives us the tools to heal the visible world.
It really does.
That's the heart of this section. This is Wisdom for the Present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.